Hello, and welcome once again to a special bonus episode of the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we are very excited to welcome to the show once again Shamma Boyarin, who is an assistant professor in the English department at the University of Victoria. He is also the director of the Religion, Culture, and Society program, and his research and teaching interests span medieval literature, specifically focusing on Hebrew and Arabic literature, as well as religion and pop culture. And he has a particular interest in the Disciplina Clericalis. So we're excited to have him here. Welcome to the show again, Shamma.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me back. I don't know if you guys will edit this out, but I have to say that if it wasn't for the affection that I have for the two of you guys, for how much I like the podcast, and for the specific book that we're talking about, I would probably say no at this point in the semester. It's just kind of overwhelming. But for this, I wanted to make time. It's something I care about, and it's a context that I would love to have these conversations with you guys.
Well, thank you very much for making the time. I'm excited to find out more about your relationship with this book that you're passionate about. How did you first encounter the Disciplina Clericalis?
So I actually came to it rather late in terms of my working or thinking about Petrus Alfonsi. And in some ways, in an odd way for a lit person, I actually thought of Petrus Alfonsi first from the perspective of his contributions to the history of science. One of the things that he's known for is bringing with him some astronomical tables that were then adapted by Adelard of Bath, an English astronomer. And it's not so much that I'm a history of science person, but I'm really interested in the kind of confluence of science and literature and ways in which people who did literature in some way were also involved in this kind of science philosophy angle. And when I was a graduate student, Charles Burnett was a guest scholar at Berkeley, and he works on Adelard of Bath a lot. And from him, I kind of heard about Petrus Alfonsi and this connection to science. I was kind of thinking about him in that vein before ever approaching the literary aspect of it. And then my dissertation work is on the Alexander romance and Alexander tradition more broadly. And you talked about, the parable of Alexander's tomb. So that was another angle that I got involved. So before kind of reading the whole scholar's guide in its entirety, I kind of approached it from these weird angles and kind of picked out specific things. And then it was only recently when I was designing a course on medieval literature in England and wanted to kind of put my own spin on it that I decided to revisit the scholar's guide in that context and read it again and kind of reimagined the whole thing from this perspective.
You said so many interesting things there. I'm trying to gather them up on the fingers of my hand here. The history of science side of that, I find that so interesting too, especially for the 12th century. And I feel like we could talk about that all day long. I don't know if anybody else would care about it, but I would really love that. But the other thing you were talking about, which I would love to hear you talk about more, is doing a course on literature of medieval England and doing it in a different kind of way. So, thinking about how does Petrus Alfonsi fit into that story? And it opens up so many different doors, not just one, but so many different doors.
Yeah. So, there's one kind of practical element of it that I was asked to teach this introduction to medieval British literature, everything on the table except for Chaucer. And being a non-specialist, I wanted to sort of work with texts that I felt somewhat familiar with, that I had encountered. And like I said, I hadn't done a lot with the Scholar's Guide, but I knew some stuff about it because of the Alexander material and because of the science. So I felt like I had some entryway. So that was kind of a practical element. But then I have been sort of attached to an English department for some time now, but I'm trained in medieval Hebrew and Arabic. And I've been thinking a lot about the place of medieval Hebrew authors from England in sort of the canon and how they could help us reimagine what medieval English literature looked like. And picking up off what some people have been doing with Anglo-Norman and Latin and all of that, but sort of taking it one step further by adding Hebrew into the mix.
So what are the kinds of texts did you put into that course to make it a little different?
So we begin with the poetry of Mayor of Norwich. And Mayor of Norwich was a Jew of England who wrote in Hebrew and, from a certain perspective, didn't really influence kind of Christian English literature, but he identified as English. His poetry is full of him listing that he's mayor of Norwich from England. So in his literature, he identifies himself as English. So beginning with that kind of question of what does it mean to write in Hebrew in the Middle Ages and to identify yourself as English, and how does imagining that kind of open up a question? And then we're doing Petrus Alfonsi, we're doing Marie de France, we're doing, why am I blanking right now on the name? The Traveler.
Mandeville?
Yes, right, who's not even a real person, and sort of kind of thinking about what is English literature and what do all these people have to contribute to the mix.
It's neat when you were talking about Meyer of Norwich writing in Hebrew, but clearly having a sense of himself as being of England, of Norwich. It makes me think a little bit about Susan Einbinder's work on Jewish communities in France and this whole experience of some of them ending up migrating to other areas, to the south of France, to Italy, and so on, and retaining that sense of, I don't know whether to call it national identity, I don't know what to call that, but some sense of also Frenchness. And it wasn't about language only, it was about other things as well.
Exactly. And sort of, opening just a question as an experiment, at first in a class, but also, in a broader sense, if we're already exploring, English literature, English identity as being more than just about writing in, let's say, Middle English, why stop with Latin and Anglo-Norman? And what does that do to our sense of England as a place and to Englishness, to cross borders? And Petrus Alfonsi is a great person to do that with, because he himself kind of embodies, right, crossing borders, faith borders, and identity borders, and linguistic borders in complicated ways.
There's so much to say about that. I don't even know which thing to start with. What's your sense of his world? Like, I can think of about 4 different answers to that question. Like, what's his world? What's his environment? I mean, because he moves from place to place, he experiences religious conversion. He's writing in Latin, and it's hard to know if that's a language that he's writing in from an early date or something he comes to later on. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that you brought up in your other recording, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. He writes the Dialogi, he presents it as being written fairly close to after his conversion. And I'm not at a place to sort of judge the level of his literateness in Latin, but it seems to me that he must have been somewhat literate in Latin before the conversion. The way he presents what he goes through in the Dialogi and the level of his familiarity with Christian doctrine suggests that it was coming from a somewhat learned position. Now, I agree with you that it probably as an adult, but that taking on the Christian identity, part of it comes with learning Latin for him. So that's what I would say about that aspect. Another thing, and again, this is related to some of the stuff that you brought up in your conversation already, I think we need to really realize, and I think it makes sense if we think about the kind of cultural component of Al-Andalus that he comes from, that you already described, Suzanne, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims had a certain shared cultural component, a shared scientific component that they all felt was not changed by whether one was Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, right? That they felt was all shared.
Like a common ground or something like that.
And at the same time, something that marked difference, right? Something that a Jew would disagree with a Muslim, and vice versa. And so when we come and see him saying in the beginning of the Disciplina Clericalis in the Scholar's Guide that he's bringing with him wisdom from the Arab kind of part of him, that would represent, and it's nebulous, the borders are a bit complicated, but that would represent something that comes from that shared place that he doesn't see as being in contradiction with becoming a Christian, because it wasn't in contradiction between when he was a Jew. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, that it could be part of any one of those worlds, and it can travel with you when you travel from place to place, like physically, but also metaphorically.
Right. So there's no contradiction between him, on the one hand, adopting Christianity as an identity and saying, I am a Christian now, and also saying this stuff is still relevant, both to me and to you, because it was relevant to him as a Jew, and it didn't seem in contradiction back in Al-Andalus between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So it should be something that is still relevant to Christians, as opposed to certain things that, that he wouldn't feel still carried forward. right? And I think we need to recognize that it's not just okay, I see no contradiction between these things as coming from an Arab or a polytheist pagan context, because they're part of things that aren't in contradiction, but there's other things that I can't. Basically, what he's saying in the Scholar's Guide, these are the kinds of wisdom things that transcend. They come from a Arab background.
And he's explicit about that. Like he'll say, the Arab says, or the Arab said to his son, or whatever.
But some of them have Islamic elements. You talked about how in one of the stories there's kind of a pilgrimage in Rome to the holy places, which would mark it as Christian. One of the stories has a man going on pilgrimage to Mecca. So there are certain elements that are Muslim elements, but the kind of kernel of wisdom transcends religious difference. But that doesn't mean that religious difference isn't a real thing for Petrus Alfonsi. It is.
I think that's so fascinating because when you talk about religious difference, on the one hand, if we're talking about theology, yeah, that's a thing, where the line is absolute, there is no blurring of that boundary, right? But there's all kinds of, I don't know what to call it, cultural, practical, everyday life things that might or might not come across. And in that light, I'm really enchanted by this one aspect of the Disciplina Clericalis, the section on table manners and how you deport yourself at the table. And I was struck by that because not in Petrus's own time, but later on in the 12th century and the 13th century, there's all kinds of prohibitions around the kinds of things you can and cannot do with people who are not of your same religious group. And so I wondered about, commensality, like eating together, manners. I wondered if that was somehow a thing to think about in this text.
It's definitely a thing to think about. As I was designing the class, I came across this article, and I should have checked who wrote it, but before you guys post, we should get the link. But basically, it was an argument along the lines of what I was thinking, that the Scholar's Guide should be taught in medieval English Lit survey courses. And the author of that article, one of the things that he quotes is an essay by you, Suzanne, Between Diaspora and Conquest, Norman Assimilation, in Petrus Alfonsi's Disciplina Clericalis and Marie de France's Fables. And there you talk about eating. So I have been thinking about eating. And so, first of all, this ties into what we have been talking about. Petrus Alfonsi, very open about things being taken from the Arabs and citing, Arab culture. But there's no mention of things coming from Jewish tradition and Jewish sources, except the one moment that it does come up is around eating. And we can get back to this in a moment. You guys talked about it, how things are nestled one in the other, and there's kind of you start with one thing and then it leads to another thing. So talking about table manners begins with table manners in the presence of the king, and this is a discussion between a son and a father, leads the son to ask, if someone invites me to dinner, how shall I answer him? Should I accept it at once or not? And then the father says, follow the Jewish custom. And this is the first time that we get something that comes from Judaism and is attributed explicitly. Now, I know that you guys are aware of this, but for the listeners, there's a lot of biblical quotations in the Scholar's Guide. Those don't come across as being particularly necessarily Jewish because they're part of the shared biblical tradition that a Christian audience would associate with their Bible. So that's not necessarily marked as Jewish. So this is the only place. And then we get a discussion of what Jews say about if you're invited to eat or not. So it's interesting that you're right that there's something going on about eating that it might cue a, Christian Jewish issue that he kind of falls back on Jewish elements. The other thing about this, and this ties to something that I want to kind of explore a little bit, the advice doesn't necessarily portray Jews in a positive light. Because what the father says, if someone offers you an invitation, consider the person who invites you. If he is an important person, accept immediately. If not, accept the second or third time according to who he may be, right? And there's multiple ways that we can think about why they don't give an explanation why this is how you should do it and why this should be the Jewish custom. One way is, if somebody's important, you don't dally. You're being invited to an important person's house. That's an honor. You go. If somebody's less important, you can, be more rude to them and not necessarily accept immediately. Or it could be a reflection of, Jewish marginality and danger. You don't dare offend somebody who is important, so you immediately accept. But if somebody is less powerful, less important, you have more room to kind of assert your identity. So there's something about that is really interesting. Then the example that is brought up is interesting in and of itself. It's again a biblical reference. It goes back to the story of Abraham and Lot, where three men show up and they turn out to be angels. When Abraham invites them to eat, it's not the angels who are the important, it's Abraham who's important. When Abraham invites them to eat, they immediately accept. But when Lot invites them in, they decline. So that illustrates kind of the Jewish custom, which is really interesting.
I was fascinated by the Abraham story that shows up there because what it's doing, and this was implicit in what you were just saying, but I just wondered if you want to flesh it out a little bit. Like Abraham is the role of the important person. The angels are the ones who are following the Jewish custom.
Exactly.
Which is so neat.
And exactly, and it's not unpacked, right? It's just left there, and you just have to kind of figure out how the story illustrates what we just were told. And there's a lot of that, and maybe I'll get back to that the stories seem to make sense if you just think about them, but then you have to sort of think about, wait a second, what exactly is the analogy? What exactly is the lesson? And then things start to get a little bit more interesting and complicated and perhaps contradictory. And then that leads to further discussion about how you should behave if you're a guest in terms of eating. So after the story of Lot, the young man asked the old man, "What should I do when I'm invited to eat? Should I eat very much or very little?" And the old man says, "Eat a lot, because if it's somebody who's friendly to you, they'll be happy that you're eating. And if it's your enemy, it'll make them sad that you're eating so much food." And that's great for the segue to Maimonides the slave. Because in response to that advice about eating a lot, the boy laughs and the old man says, "Why are you laughing?" And the boy says, "I'm reminded of the answer of Maimonides the black slave." An old man asked him how much he could eat. He answered, "Whose food, mine or someone else's?" The old man, "Your own." Maimonides, "As little as possible." The old man, "Someone else's." Maimonides, "As much as possible." Functionally, Maimonides' answer is the same as the old man's in the previous one, right? When Maimonides is a guest, he eats as much as possible. If it's his own, he doesn't, right? So functionally, there's a lot of similarity, although it's not exactly the same. And I'll get back to the old man because I think Chris is right that there is a kind of breaking down of who is the narrator, and that's a bit deliberate in my point of view. But to this young man who just told the story of Maimonides the slave, the old man said to the boy, "You only remember the words of the gluttonous, lazy, stupid, talkative, and trifling man," which is Maimonides the slave. And here we have a bit of a slippage because in the context of medieval Al-Andalus, a black slave has one kind of context that Petrus is bringing with him that doesn't necessarily in medieval England have the same resonance. But at the same time, we're getting a series of very negative associations with this black slave that even then would kind of be a stereotype. And in the main recording, Suzanne, you mentioned that this is a racist moment in the text. And it definitely is. I don't want to sort of downplay that. But at the same time, when we look at the actual stories that are meant to illustrate all of these characteristics, they don't actually illustrate that he is, in fact, all of these things. And we get actually stories that illustrate that he's clever, resourceful. The final story, which is meant to illustrate that he's talkative, actually illustrates that he's not, and that he ends up winning his freedom. So it doesn't quite work the way it seems to be working, is what I'm saying. And maybe let's talk about that last story. It's the longest one in these series of anecdotes of Maimonides the slave. By the way, I have not done a lot of work trying to track down the sources of these things because it's not, at this point in my thinking, the main question. But I haven't been able to find the name Maimonides the slave and as a stock character in anything prior. So he seems, at least as a name and as kind of a Petrus Alfonsi invention, at least as far as I've been able to find at this point. But basically, it begins with Maimonides' master saying, you're so talkative, today I don't want you to talk. And basically, these series of terrible things happen that the master has to kind of get out from Maimonides in stages because he told him not to talk. And it turns out that basically all of the master's family has died in a fire. All of his possessions have been destroyed. Only Maimonides is left, and Maimonides goes kind of free afterwards. So it kind of turns, and all of these stories turn the master's power on their head. So there's something going on in the stories themselves that don't fit what the father says about Maimonides. And there's these moments in the Scholar's Guide where they're not necessarily contradictions, but they're ruptures, they're gaps between what is happening and what we actually notice that I think suggests that what Petrus Alfonsi is doing, and you talked in your recording about sort of the dialogic genre.
I was just going to ask you about that. Yeah.
That he's actually using it in a sophisticated way to kind of undercut it. That it's a didactic literature that's anti-didactic in its kind of mode.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about dialogue because it seems like this is such a great moment to be thinking about that. That back and forth in that nested anecdote where it's the master says something, then the slave says something, the master, the slave. So, for example, the master, what frightened the mule? The slave, your son fell from the balcony and was killed and the mule was frightened by it. The master, what is his mother doing? The slave, because of her great grief for her son, she died. The master, who is guarding the house? The slave, no one, for it burned to ashes and with everything in it. And it's so weird because it's really funny, because
Yes.
It's like one of these stories that it just amps up and amps up with each round. But it's also like this, I don't know what to call it, like ping pong back and forth, the two halves of the dialogue. And we've been in the dialogue all the time. So this is like this hyper dialogic kind of passage.
It's hyper dialogic. It's funny, but it's also, slowly the master and the reader is learning, something tragic happened, right? Everybody is dead.
And the master-slave relationship is being undone.
Exactly. And it's also the section that transitions to that section on death that you guys talked about. So, it sets the tone for the ending of the book, which is, as you said, this meditation on death. But it does it in a way that's unexpected because it doesn't say, Maimonides the slave is going to tell us now about this death thing, and then that's going to lead to a meditation about how transient life is. So the nesting kind of leads the reader unexpectedly suddenly to a turn that in some ways, as you said, Suzanne, makes sense. It's the end of the book, and there's a kind of a beginning that begins very somber, and this is going to be, a book about learning how to get to heaven, and it ends at the place that you would expect, but it gets there in a very unexpected way. And the layers, the frustration that Chris expressed in your recording about not being able to keep track of the layers, I think is part of this, the form of this book. That is that it takes what seems to be a very simple form of dialogue and master, student, father, son, king, poet, but they're so nestled that it kind of undercuts the authority that is built into the dialogue. You approach these dialogues, or the reader is meant to approach these dialogues feeling like, okay, that there's a certain relationship between teacher and student, but these relationships, as you guys kind of already addressed a little bit, are not stable. And so it kind of opens up a place of critique to the whole kind of system that is based on, the teacher student coming with wisdom. And I think this reflects back on some of what we talked about, that is Petrus Alfonsi's place in the world. And I don't have kind of a fully fleshed out, I have kind of different options of exploring this idea. One is as somebody who is coming as an outsider and who wants to assert a certain position of authority, but is not fully certain in it. So it's unstable. He's unstable vis-a-vis these addressees, these scholars, right? So his position is not one of fully adopting it. Or what I find even more interesting is that what he's trying to do is critique the scholarly culture that he's a part of, and to kind of present it as not ideal in a certain way and kind of to destabilize it.
I was wondering about this with regard to the dialogic format. One of the things that I'm endlessly fascinated by is what happens in the 12th century with dialogues. And as you know, because of this history of science context we were talking about before, they're like all over the place in the 12th century. So Adelard of Bath is doing it. William of Conches is doing it in the Dragmaticon. Like it's all over. And I don't know, but like, is Petrus somehow part of that lineage, or is it just this is a thing they're all doing in the 12th century?
I definitely think he's part of a lineage, but I think we have to think about it in two kind of ways. In a certain way, right, because those other examples, and I'm not familiar with all of them, but let's say the example of Adelard of Bath. There, the dialogue and the kind of teacher-student relationship is much more stable. Right. And it never breaks down, and it really works for the reader to follow through.
All of them, they're absolutely different in that way, right? Like the relationship's totally stable. This one kind of deconstructs it. Like it almost sets the pattern and also deconstructs it.
And I think one of the things, and you brought up the adab literary tradition in Arabic, and there is a subset both in adab and in kind of broader Arabic literary traditions that also blend into Hebrew of kind of as anti-wisdom, of kind of using the form in a way that a careful reader realizes is critiquing it, is destabilizing it. It's still about a kind of didactic literature, but it's undercutting it in certain ways. I wanted to kind of shore this up with a couple more examples of moments where the text doesn't work the way you think it does. And I wanted to talk about one example that you guys brought up, the story of the weeping dog, because something happens at the end of that story that you guys talked about, but I think needs to be paid more attention to. At the end of the story, the pupil said to the teacher, "I have never heard anything so astounding, and I think it was done with black magic."
Mm.
And what was done with black magic? Because we know that nobody was transformed into a dog. So even the student kind of is so caught up in the story that he believes the woman's lie, but we know that
it's just a lie.
Right? And there's these moments where, and this is what I mean by the kind of things don't add up, and there's all of these ruptures. And then there's two important, I think, moments that also relate kind of to this bigger question on believing what you read. A philosopher advised his son, saying to him, "Read everything you find, but do not believe everything you read." Does that apply to this book as well? And then the next, on receiving and testing advice, an Arab warned his son, telling him, "Accept advice from a man who you know has already tried it, instead of exposing yourself to danger in testing it." And again, does that mean that all of the advice in this book has been tested by Petrus Alfonsi or by the people quoted? And then there's a story about a person that illustrates it. So the point is, I think there are these hints built into the scholar's guide that suggest reading it at face value as simply a dialogic story with lots of interesting parables is not getting the full picture.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think I expressed some of this in the main episode, but I have difficulty thinking of this as an actually educative text rather than a series of delightful stories and feel-good aphorisms sort of littering it. I mean, I don't want to say that that's nothing, but that's something very different from what it would be if you were really trying to do what he says he's setting out to do in the introduction. That doesn't mean that you can't learn things from it, like be critical of things you read, etc. I'm not sure if this is entirely constructed to that end, but there's definitely plenty of things going on where it's like, this is weird.
But isn't that those moments that you're talking about, Shamma, where you get tripped up and you're like, for example, the people's like, "Oh, clearly that was black magic." And, as a reader, I mean, speaking for myself, you kind of go, "Oh, yeah, right." And then you're like, as you say, you pause, you're like, "Wait, no, that didn't happen." Like, is that the education that's happening here where you trip over it?
Yeah. So, Chris, I would say two things. First of all, I do think that we should not at all discount the possibility that under the guise of saying that it's something about teaching, that it's really about something about, let's tell a lot of fun stories and some, stories that are grotesque and slightly risque. And that might be part of it. But I also think that the lessons that it's teaching, and perhaps unsuccessfully, and perhaps that is due to it crossing too many kind of cultural and literary lines that it doesn't succeed in this sense, is that a straightforward book of wisdom does not work. And the kind of advice that it is purporting to give in the world that Petrus Alfonsi finds himself doesn't work. So you can't, do all the things that it tells you to do and actually end up in heaven. That you can't, guard yourself from women, that you can't live, a virtuous life. I like the metaphor that Suzanne used of a train track, but I'm going to reverse it. That essentially that you can't travel that track and end up in heaven. That there isn't a book that anybody could write that would, take all this wisdom of Aristotle and the Arabs, and you read it, and even if you're the smartest person, you would end up in the right place. It's kind of a cynical take. And I'm exploring that. I don't know if I'm totally convinced by that, but that's kind of the experiment that I'm doing.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really plausible reading of the mindset of the author here. Whether this is meant to elicit that in the reader, I don't know. But like, if that's a sort of assumption behind the author, that I totally buy.
And let me kind of try to shore that up a little bit by talking about the end.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask you. Yeah. Because that is kind of, I don't want to say didactic maybe, but like educative, right? Pedagogical in a particular kind of way.
So there's two layers. There's the epilogue, and then there's the on the fear of God kind of last moment, right?
Mm-hmm. And even before that, like that section on the instability of worldly things.
Yes.
Right? It's already moving into that like commemorative mode or rememorative mode.
Elegiac.
Well, I don't know what to make it. Like, it's not like theological or preachy or anything like that, but it's basically think about your end. And so that already shows up right after the Maimonides exchange that you were talking about earlier, where we're asked to remember the prophet Job and to think about the words of the philosopher, who in this world, since it is variable, can have anything stable, or who can have anything enduring in this life, since all things are transitory. Then there's a section on the instability of worldly things, which has this lovely, again, kind of repetitive structure, not quite dialogic, but one philosopher says this one thing, another, everything in this world is changeable, another, the sluggard is permitted to obtain his desires, whereas the diligent man is denied what he strives for. Another, the world dishonors him who beautifies himself. Another, the glory of the world ends in the twinkling of an eye. You know what I mean? And so each section kind of is bringing new changes on these kinds of things that you need to think about and meditate on, like the end of life and so on.
Yeah. So there's definitely that, but again, so for example, the one that you quoted about the sluggard being, how does that fit in? Right. So in some ways it seems to fit in, but it also suggests that there is no rhyme or reason to how, right. And you're right that in a sense, it kind of encourages a focus on death, but at the same time, it suggests that certain aspects of life are chaotic, are random.
Everything is transitory.
Yes.
Which is different from random, I think. Everything is changeable.
Everything is changeable, but at the same time, the sluggard does get to enjoy stuff.
As we move through these last sections, we have all these different ways of thinking about the end. A section on death, a section that's the parable of the philosopher who passed through a cemetery, and then Alexander's golden tomb. And I want to make sure to take time to talk about that because I'm really eager to hear how you think about the punctuation almost of Alexander's tomb, the way in which it kind of draws together all those threads that we've been moving toward.
So I think you covered it pretty well in your discussion. I'll just say that really, as you said, Suzanne, Alexander becomes in some ways par excellence the example for all of these. First of all, for the connection between philosophy and kind of life in certain ways, right? Through his amplified in some ways connection to Aristotle and kind of marked as a student of Aristotle, which is commented on earlier in the text, but also the transitory nature of all of these things, right? As somebody who achieved at a very young age great things conquered and glory and all of that, but that none of that survived him, that, the moment he died, it all became meaningless. It's not so much mentioned in the Scholar's Guide, but it's in the background that even his empire doesn't last after his death, right? So that all of that could be said that he achieved immediately crumbles. And especially, and we get it here, the tomb, this golden tomb, becomes a symbol for all of that, right? And the way the philosophers come and kind of turn it into a lesson becomes itself really emblematic.
Now, when you teach this text, how does it go over? I've read it many times over many years, and I have used it in a grad classroom, like in passing, but I've never had it be kind of the focus of what we're studying. And I've never used it in an undergraduate class, though I put it in an anthology once. So I don't have this experience. So what's that like?
So it teaches very well, I think, in part because the format is, on the one hand, really strange, right? And there's this feeling of like, we don't quite know what's going on and, who's telling the story and what. But on the other hand, the stories are somewhat entertaining. People get very upset and want to talk about the parable of the female weeping dog. So there's a lot to kind of react to and think about. And then, especially this year with the way my class is set up, I'm recording sort of not lectures, but kind of video casts on it. And then we have a third meeting afterwards where we kind of come together and they as a class discuss it. I'm really finding that I can sort of give them questions and point them to things that then they take in interesting directions. So in many ways, this podcast is the first time that I'm actually saying things about it, as opposed to saying, well, what do you do with this moment? And how do we relate to these things? And, so a lot of what I told them is kind of context about Petrus Alfonsi, but not so much lectured on kind of close reading and stuff like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, that's so neat.
I could easily imagine students taking a chunk of this and just running with it. I mean, that's what the text asks you to do, in a sense, which is great. I think we need to start wrapping up here, but I wanted to give you a chance. You've said many reasons to consider this work and consider it within the, let's say, canon of literature from England. Is there anything else you want to say to promote this book as something that we should be thinking about or teaching more?
Well, I don't know that I'm necessarily convinced by my reading, but I think there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And the more people engage with it, the more people think about it, the more people teach it, I think what it's doing will become more apparent. And I think the translation is decent, but I think, newer translations, that would put it in different contexts, would make it, I think the question, for example, that Suzanne asked about its place in relationship to the dialogue genre in the West, I think that's a really important question. And I think, if we have more scholars working on it and we have more students studying it, and it'll just kind of lead to new ideas about, knowledge, storytelling. I think the question that Chris raised about, is it just stories for story's sake? That would be a really interesting idea to tease out, that, under the guise of teaching, he's really just entertaining.
It looks so different depending on what context you put it in, So if you put it with, I don't know, excerpts from 1001 Nights, it looks a lot like them in some places, like the ways in which somebody will be talking about, something, and then the other person says, wow, this really reminds me of the story of such and such, like there are moments like that. And then the dialogues, the same thing. If you put it in the context of some of those, it looks really different again.
And one more element that I want to add in there is these series of anecdotes of Maimundus the Black Slave. At a time when we're trying to unpack and think about, medieval race and accesses of, that we have this moment in this specific text that is an intersection of culture and tradition, that I think getting, scholars who work on race, who work on slavery in Al-Andalus, to kind of deal with it and to think about what does it mean for a convert from Spain to be telling these stories in medieval England, would lead to a really interesting conversation that I think is being kind of left out.
There's a lot of readings left to make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing your readings and helping flesh out our readings and enriching the text.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shamma. I really appreciate you taking the time, especially in these hard days.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
All right, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter, and we'd always love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/36b, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.